Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome again to Syriana Analysis. I'm your host, Kevork Almassian. Thank you very much for tuning into today's live streaming. I appreciate you all, guys, whether you're watching on YouTube or on Rumble. Today, I'm joined by Mikael Valtersson. He was a former officer in the Swedish Armed Forces, particularly in the Air Force, former defense politician and chief of staff of the Sweden Democrats, and currently he is a political and military analyst. Mikael, thank you so much for being with me today. It's a really pleasure to have you on my show to listen to your perspective because, in my opinion, I have listened enough to the talking heads on the mainstream media telling me how important it is for Sweden to join NATO. And also I would like to hear to different ideas and different perspectives so that the people in the online community can make up their mind whether the Swedish accession to NATO would be positive for Sweden and for the region or not. So thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me.
Great.
Very nice to being here.
Yeah, it's a really pleasure. I was going to start this conversation with you with what the Association Press said in this regard. The Association Press says Sweden officially joins NATO, ending decades of post-World War II neutrality. And they say Sweden on Thursday formally joined NATO as the 32nd member of the Transatlantic Military Alliance, ending decades of post-World War II neutrality and centuries of broader non-alignment with major powers. President Joe Biden congratulated Sweden on its admission and said it was a sign that Russian President Vladimir Putin's intervention in Ukraine had united rather than divided the alliance. Swedish Prime Minister Ulf Kristersson was a guest of honor Thursday evening at Biden's State of Union address to Congress, where the president welcomed him to, quote, the strongest military alliance the world has ever seen, quote, ended. And then they speak about the Article 5 of NATO's treaty, which obliges all members to come to the aid of an ally whose territory or security is under threat. It has only been activated once by the United States after September 11 attacks and is a collective security guarantee that Sweden has sought since Russia invaded Ukraine. Finally, they remind us that Sweden, along with Finland, which joined NATO last year, both abandoned the long-standing military neutrality that was a hallmark of the Nordic states' Cold War foreign policy after Russia invaded Ukraine in early 2022. And this is in the mainstream media, right? Now, I want to walk with you in history a little bit because Sweden had a policy of neutrality in armed conflicts from the early 19th century. Could you expand on the historical context which led to the birth of the Swedish neutrality in the 19th century? I think this was after the Napoleonic Wars, and also yes. in the 20th century we had two world wars, and also Sweden was in neutral position.
There's a difference between Sweden and Switzerland. Switzerland had internationally guaranteed neutrality, and it has always been so. But in Sweden's case, it just grew organically because after the Napoleon War, we decided we didn't want to be enemy to Russia. We got a French king. The only thing that survived the Napoleonic Wars in France was the Swedish king. He was a French marshal before that. And he didn't want to have the usual Swedish conflict with Russia. So we were neutral, you could say, because there weren't any alliances at that time. And then the years went by, and it was close several times that we got into war. In 1863, there was a war between Prussia and Austria against Denmark. And the Swedish king had promised Denmark support, but the Swedish government thought we will lose. So we abandoned the Denmark. So it grew bit by bit. And even during the 20th century, if we look at the First World War, many in Sweden wanted to fight on the German side against Russia. to either reclaim or make Finland independent. And it was like this also during the Second World War. But Sweden has been divided during the Second World War into two groups. One that was more pro-Anglo-Saxon and one pro-German. So it was not a planned policy to become neutral, but as the year went by and we avoided war, it became more and more an accepted fact. And after the Second World War, Finland was under the threat to become another Warsaw Pact state with a communist regime. But they tried to keep by being very neutral, and they had a friendship and security pact with Russia. If Sweden also avoided becoming part of NATO, we might keep Finland independent, and it succeeded. But from the first, after the Second World War, Sweden wanted to have a Nordic alliance, but Finland and Denmark thought Sweden is too weak a partner to defend us. So when they went to NATO, we did everything to save Finland.
Mm-hmm. Correct me if I'm wrong. Today I was doing some research on this issue, especially about the World War II neutrality position of Sweden. And I found out that despite the official neutrality, Sweden exported iron and steel to Germany, which the latter needed for war production back then against Russia.
Yes.
And this,
yes.
And this was a division.
We decided that normal economical ties with every state, it wasn't a breach against neutrality, but it was very hard for Sweden to export things to Great Britain, but it was much easier to Germany. But we did other things also. We let German troops pass through Sweden between when they were on leave. They were allowed to travel through Sweden, and one of the divisions who attacked Russia or the Soviet Union at that time, the Engelbrecht division, was also traveling through Sweden. So it was in many ways a rather close cooperation with Germany during the Second World War. But it started to change after Stalingrad. When we realized that Germany would lose, then we had to move the other way. So at the end of the war, in May 1945, the garrison in Norway didn't know what to do, and there were 300,000 German soldiers there. Then Sweden decided, we will join the war if they don't capitulate and invade Norway. But they realized that they couldn't survive by themselves.
And which year was this? In 45?
Yes, 45. At the beginning of May, when all other German troops were capitulating. But the commander in Norway wasn't sure what he would do. If I remember right, he shot himself, and then the German forces capitulated.
Mm-hmm. I also learned so many new realities about World War II recently, about some of the bankers in the United States who were financing Nazi Germany back then in order to finance his war machine against Russia. But then when the balance of power started to shift on the side of the Soviet Union, in order not to give this victory and a golden plate to the USSR, and back then if the USSR wins against Germany, then they will occupy and conquer entire Europe, then the Brits and the Americans were more encouraged to get involved in this war against Germany, so that they disallow Russia to have the fruits of the victory, right?
Yes, Churchill first wanted an invasion in the Balkans, so they could cut off the Soviet Union from taking much of Europe, but it wasn't feasible. So they went for southern Italy first, and then France in 1944.
But after World War II, Sweden maintained its policy of neutrality, right? And they refused to join NATO. But
Yes.
this was out of fears that the Soviet Union might respond then by invading Finland, with which Sweden retained close relations. How is the situation different from Cold War era today? I mean, back then the argument was if we join NATO or if we choose to be in an alliance that is anti-Soviet Union, then probably the Soviet Union would invade Finland, and we have good relationship with Finland, and we are a neighboring country to Finland. Then next could be us. And nowadays we can see so many indications that we are living a Cold War era again. Like it seems like this is 2.0, right? And
yes.
how is it different nowadays? Why the calculations of Sweden has changed?
Well, first of all, during the Cold War, Sweden tried to have many roles at the same time, because we had a secret cooperation military with the US, and at the same time, the prime minister in the 70s from the Social Democrats, Olof Palme, he was a very outspoken critic of the Vietnam War, and the US recalled its ambassador from Sweden at the same time as the military in secret had a cooperation. And of course, the political leadership knew that. But for Finland, they bought maybe 50% of their weapons from the Soviet Union and 50% from the West, but the West was mainly Sweden. So, and Sweden was neutral. But after 1991, when the Soviet Union was dissolved, and the Warsaw Pact also had been dissolved, they slowly, at the beginning, moved away from the close cooperation with the earlier Soviet Union and now Russia. And the first big sign of it was when they bought new fighter aircrafts. They bought the F-18 from the US. Sweden was, of course, disappointed. They had hoped they would buy the Swedish JAS. And but until then, they had the Russian warplanes also. And it was during the 90s. It was Russia wasn't seen as an enemy anymore, and we knew it when Putin also said that he asked if Russia could join NATO around 2000, and so it wasn't seen as Russia wasn't seen as a threat. We didn't have to react to them. We didn't have to join the NATO. Many in Sweden thought that NATO was something that was from the past, and NATO partly thought that also. They started to do operation outside of Europe, especially the long period in Afghanistan. But after the invasion in Georgia in 2008, then the climate started to change, and especially after 2014. But still, in Sweden, a majority of the population and the major party the Social Democrats, was very against NATO. They have always been seen as both neutral, but also as an important country in the non-aligned world. So the Social Democrats have good relations with many countries in the global south, and they're not been a very outspoken Western party. And nobody also saw Russia as a great threat, but it was growing. And when Finland decided that after the February 24th, 2022, that they wanted to join NATO, then everything changed in Sweden. If Finland hadn't said that they would join, I don't believe that Sweden would have joined either. But because during the last decade before that, we had a growing defense cooperation with Finland. I personally, when I was in the parliament in Stockholm, was in Finland several times with the Swedish defense politicians and visited the Finnish defense department, and also different. We went to air bases and different military installations. So it was a growing. It was partly an alliance. It wasn't an official alliance, but it was seen as a neutral alliance between Sweden and Finland. And when they suddenly decided to join NATO, everybody in Sweden said, "Well, if we are they are the eastern part of our mini alliance, and if they join NATO, we do it also."
No.
And nobody did any protested among the politicians in Sweden. The Social Democrats changed sides very quickly, and when they did it, it wasn't an election question either. And my old party, the Sweden Democrats, had always also been against NATO, and of course argued for a Nordic alliance. It might be a bit unrealistic when Denmark and Norway was part of NATO, but they also changed side directly, and it wasn't an election question in Sweden because everybody said we want to join NATO, and so the people wasn't really asked.
Yes. This is the question that I was going to ask you. I mean, you mentioned a few things here. I just want to show you what a friend, a colleague of mine, his name is Thomas Fazi from Italy. He's an author and he is a journalist. He says Sweden joining NATO in 2024 has got to be one of the dumbest geopolitical moves in a recorded history. Getting your official, quote, U.S. vassal membership card at the time when the U.S.-centric system is collapsing before our own eyes, like joining the Warsaw Pact in early 91. This is the question, like, for example, you also raised the people were not asked. Do you think it was better to ask the people through a referendum, for example? Because when the people elected these political parties, the issue of the NATO membership was not on the table. Correct me if I'm wrong. But then when
that's right.
When this new issue came, this is a detrimental thing, and it shifts the entire position of Sweden from one place to another. So shouldn't the people be asked through a referendum, at least if they want to join NATO? And because they have to spend now more also money and taxpayer money in the defense industry, right?
Yes, of course, they should have been asked, and the politicians said, well, if they didn't want to join NATO, they could vote for another party. But if you don't vote on every issue. You choose a party because you like most of the issues. So it should have been a real referendum as for NATO, EU membership or the Euro, but it wasn't. And they were afraid that they would lose momentum. I believe that they might have won, but it depends on when. If there had been an election referendum now, it would have been much closer than for 2 years ago, because about 55% of the population say that they are through NATO. But then the entire political establishment and the media in Sweden are pro NATO. So it would have been interesting to see if there had been more neutral media and some politicians who spoke out against it. Then it might be a much closer race. And of course, what Pasi said, it's also true. Sweden will probably become a very loyal NATO member. We are always trying to be best in the class. If the EU says that the rules shall be followed, Sweden does it, even if all other countries say, well, Brussels says many things. And we will say the same about NATO. But as you said, the US unipolar world is falling apart. And we don't even know what will happen later this year after the election in the US. Because Trump isn't a big fan of NATO. I remember I wrote, about 10 years ago, about the future of European security report to the defense. And I said, one major country might leave EU. We don't know if the US will turn more to the Atlantic and abandon Europe. No, that's what's totally impossible, said everyone. And that's what's happening just now. When it says that the Republican Party in the US, they are anti-Ukraine, pro-Putin, but they are not that. They are interested in the Pacific. Yes. And they are not interested in border conflicts in Eastern Europe. And so it's not just Trump. It's the entire Republican Party are much more interested in the Pacific.
That's very true. Actually, they are also they have different priorities than in Russia. They are more focused on the Far East Asia and on Iran, for example, compared to to Russia. It seems that there was an urge by the Democratic Party now to fasten and accelerate the membership of the joining of Sweden and Finland, because they know that in the few months probably Trump would come to power and this could be no more on the table. And there was an interesting article today I was reading on the Financial Times. Mm-hmm. I want to read and ask you about it, because the article says Sweden joins NATO lake on Moscow's doorstep. And I highlighted these two paragraphs here. They say, when Russian tanks started rolling toward Kiev in February 2022, the two Nordic countries woke up to what Moscow could do to its neighbors who were not members of the military alliance. Former Swedish Prime Minister Carl Bildt said his country joining NATO would substantially increase the bang for buck in defense and deterrence in Northern Europe. And this is, in my opinion, a very important thing to focus on: deterrence, right? Every country wants deterrence. Everybody wants not to be invaded by other country, and in this case, they don't want to be invaded by Russia, right? And the question here is, will Sweden's membership to NATO increase deterrence in Northern Europe and in the Baltic countries, or this membership comes with more risks for Sweden?
It's not positive as a deterrence for Sweden. Of course, we are a member of NATO, and Russia don't want a conflict with NATO. But Russia wouldn't have attacked Sweden anyway. Sweden is not Georgia or a former republic in the Soviet Union. We have very big sea between us and them, and other countries also between us. So it would probably have been nearly impossible to invade Sweden. And many in Sweden talks about, when the Russian comes and takes Sweden, and even people that are pro-West talks about that. I saw a video recently who said, what would happen after Russian victory? Well, Sweden and Norway will become part of Russia. They have never been part of Russia. Russia has no interest in that. So for Sweden's part, the risk of being a part of a conflict has grown. But for NATO, it's of course positive to have Sweden, not the Swedish army. It's not very strong. The Swedish Air Force, and especially the Finnish and Swedish together, is very strong. It's comparable with France or Germany's. But the most important thing is to have easy access to the Baltics, the Baltic states. Because without Sweden, and also without Finland, they would be very dependent on the Slovakia gap between Poland and Lithuania, and then it would have been very hard to defend Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But for them, it's a gold mine having Sweden in NATO. But if we just look on the Swedish interest, it would have been much better to stay in neutral, because the Russia wouldn't have attacked us anyway, and it would have been much easier to have our own role as a broker and mediator. No, we have lost that totally. And also in the rest of the world, Sweden has been seen as a progressive, rather neutral state, but now we are just a small state within the Western Bloc.
This is a similar argument opposition here in Germany raises, and they say in the case of Ukraine, for example, we as Germany, we should have played a mediator role, and also Germany as a big country, influential country, we could have repositioned ourselves as a mediator power, mediating power in the world, and presented ourselves as a power that can mediate between this. And now we are aside in this war, and Sweden, I think they also lost this. I mean, during the Syrian war, for example, I was shocked to learn that how the Swedish intelligence, they turned a blind eye to the influx of these so-called jihadists from Sweden to Syria. They were like, go, it's fine. At least leave our countries and go to Syria. And they were just like exporting the threat and the dangers from their countries to our countries, right? And it wasn't a really positive role. It wasn't really a neutral role, I would argue, in this regard. And since we were speaking about the Baltic and the Baltic Sea, for example, and Sea, it was Russia which was attacked in the Baltic Sea, right? This was only a few months ago when their infrastructure, the Nord Stream pipelines were attacked, and not the other way around. And this is, I wanted your opinion about this, because for me, it sounds so surreal that in the mainstream media, they speak in this language. For example, they say Sweden, which doesn't have a direct border with Russia, is likely to play a different role for NATO military planners than the frontline states. Officials say it would be a logistic hub in case of a conflict, as well as a route for reinforcement of Finland or the Baltic states. But it also brings special capabilities. Here comes the Nord Stream pipelines. She says it has long experience with submarines and sub-sea capabilities, increasingly crucial in a Baltic Sea that has suffered several unexplained incidents of sabotage in recent years. For example, the blowing up of the Nord Stream gas pipelines. Like, there is all this attempt to keep the narrative in a way that it's unexplainable. They don't know what happened in the in the Baltic Sea. I mean, this was a Russian infrastructure. They blamed Russia at the beginning. And then when some of the facts started to surface, they started to say this was probably the pro-Ukrainian groups, and they don't want to name who is the pro-Ukrainian group. And now it's still unexplainable, because if they are honest and they say this was a Russian infrastructure, then the Russians would say, I have now security concerns in the Baltic Sea, right? But they turn things vice versa, and they... It's for me sometimes it's too dangerous when these journalists do not really tell the entire truth, and they don't show the both sides of the story, or they don't give a comprehensive analysis, because we are faced with a danger of a serious escalation now in Ukraine. And the journalists have the duty and the job to tell the truth, because the job of the journalist is to hold the politicians accountable when they are making wrong decisions, because we want to avoid wars. So the job of the journalist nowadays has become just repeating the same talking points of the governments, giving legitimacy for these wars.
Yes, and it's especially so in Sweden. There are no opposition views in the media, and I get the impression that all the media in Sweden, they read statements from the Ministry of Defense in Kiev, and they take everything that is said as the truth. And when I try to look on the war more neutrally from all sides, of course, I'm always accused of being a Russian asset, even if I'm telling the truth. But the truth is not important. It's important to support Ukraine. And Sweden is the country in Europe where the largest part of the population is positive to send military material to Ukraine, even more than in Poland. And but it's the very strong media focus on that everything is going well in Ukraine. We will defeat Russia soon, and then we have the very old Swedish animosity towards Russia. It isn't the other way around, or it hasn't been the other way around. I have many Russian friends, and everybody have loved Sweden earlier, but now they are very disappointed and wonder, why are you suddenly our main enemy in the West? And Swedish politicians say, everybody must prepare, the war can come at any day. And I say, what? When? Why? It's totally crazy.
This is something that I understood when I moved to Germany. I mean, I was naive when I moved to Germany. I bought into the illusion that there is freedom of expression. You come here, you say what you want, and there are no consequences, right? Because this is your opinion. And then I moved to Germany in late 2015, and I expressed my opinion about what's happening in Syria, and they tolerated me a few years, speaking my mind. But then when I created a YouTube channel and I started speaking in English and translating the videos in different languages about what's happening there and the root cause of the refugee crisis, which is the wars, right? I mean, why there is an influx of people here. It's not like the people arrived here and then they didn't have a choice. They created this refugee crisis in Syria, right? And then the Europeans are receiving. And then this is leading into the more anti-immigrant or anti-refugee sentiments increasing in these countries because there is open door policy. So I wanted really to touch on this really important cases, and they came after me. In the German mainstream media, they called me all sorts of names. They called me I'm sent by Assad to Germany, and that I'm his right hand in Germany. I'm right wing. I'm a fascist. I'm all the things that you can ever imagine. Just because I said like let's deal with the root cause of the problem. So I'm just an individual, and when I speak about these cases, they can do what is called character assassination. So you get afraid to speak your mind, right? And I was reading about you today and how they're attacking you because I was preparing for this interview. And as you mentioned, the truth doesn't matter. And of course, there is you're free to say what you want at certain level, but there are consequences if you speak too much or if you're influential a little bit in the public. So most of the people in Germany nowadays, what's happening in Palestine, in the Gaza Strip, they are objecting it, but they're afraid to speak their mind. And the other day when there was a big, what is called Berlinale, this is like a cinematic event for cinema. And there was a Palestinian and Israeli, they were speaking in this. And the Israeli person actually criticized his own government and called Israel an apartheid state. And he said that he doesn't agree what Israel is doing. And all the audience who were German, they applauded him and they applauded him. It shows you the mood, the general mood there. And this was a scandal in the media, and they have to bring the narrative again back and call everyone an anti-Semite, you know? So it's difficult in this environment to really speak up your mind, especially, like I'm a journalist, right? And I want to work at the end of the day, and I want to make a living. And if I'm a journalist and the first 10 or 20 newspapers or TV channels or that could employ me, having the same line, then just for an opportunistic reasons or for the sake of having bread on my table, I will get along with them unless you really choose the hard path and become an independent journalist and gain, let's say, quarter and a fraction of the money that they generate these journalists. And you stay poor for the rest of your life, right? It's really difficult. It's really difficult to tell the truth.
But you keep your pride.
Yes, of course. I can sleep. I can sleep at night in a very. My conscience is. I have a comfortable conscience, and I can stand in front of the mirror, knowing that what I'm doing is True, and I truly believe, like, I don't have even German passport, but I live here since 8 years, and I truly want for Germany to be prosperous, to be safe, to be stable. I love the country that received me and it has given me the opportunity to have a second chance in life. But when I see the politicians are not really caring for the interests of the German people, when you criticize that, then you are all of a sudden a Russian puppet. You are paid by the Kremlin and all this stuff. It's argue with me with arguments. Don't come and just smear me and say you are this and that. It just shows that you don't have an argument in this regard, and you're just here to smear me. It doesn't work that way.
No, when you are on the front page of a paper, Putin and me on the other side, and Putin's man in the Swedish defense. But the funny thing was the text that also said Putin is the one to the left, Mikael Valtersson is the one to the right. Ah, okay. They need to emphasize that. Otherwise, we are looking so alike that they could mistake us.
I will show you a video.
Crazy.
Yeah, I will show you a video from yesterday. Biden has said something, of course, on a teleprompter, because he cannot really formulate two sentences without having a teleprompter and a text in front of him. And he said, not since President Lincoln has freedom and democracy been under assault as it is today. Freedom and democracy is under attack both at home and overseas. Putin and Russia is on the march, invading Ukraine, sowing chaos throughout Europe and beyond. If anybody thinks Putin will stop at Ukraine, I assure you he will not. Let's watch together.
My purpose tonight is to wake up the Congress and alert the American people that this is no ordinary moment either. Not since President Lincoln and the Civil War have freedom and democracy been under assault at home as they are today. What makes our moment rare is that freedom and democracy are under attack both at home and overseas at the very same time. Overseas, Putin of Russia is on the march, invading Ukraine and sowing chaos throughout Europe and beyond. If anybody in this room thinks Putin will stop at Ukraine, I assure you he will not. My purpose tonight.
So, if you think that Putin will stop in Ukraine, you are wrong. He will not. I mean, for me, even on the demographic level, it doesn't make any sense. I mean, for them to occupy even Western Ukraine, it doesn't make any sense. It's a hostile environment.
No, of course
them,
not.
Right?
Yes. Yes. And I don't think that, even they could have wanted a pro-Russian government in united Ukraine, but no, I don't believe that that option is an alternative. So they want the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, and the rest as a neutral zone between them and the NATO countries. They are not interested in Finland either. They will, of course, want Finland to be neutral, but even if Finland was part of the Russian Empire until 1917, it's a totally different people with different culture and everything. And so it wouldn't be any gain for Russia to get that. Maybe Estonia and Latvia, because they are large Russian minorities. But if those countries treated their minorities as Finland treats Swedes, there wouldn't be any problem. Maybe also in Ukraine, of course, if they also didn't become members of NATO. But in Finland, today there are 6% of the population that are Swedish or Swedish speaking, but they are ethnically or culturally Swedish. And Finland is a country where everybody has the right to speak either Finnish or Swedish everywhere in the country when they go to official departments. And everybody still has to learn both languages, not much Finnish for the Swedes or the other way around. But Swedes are an honored minority in Finland. And if Russians would have been an honored minority in Estonia, Latvia, and Ukraine, the situation would have been much different. But and now people are talking about it's genocide is not just killing people, it's killing a culture, and Russia want to Russify the eastern parts of Ukraine. They don't need to Russify the eastern part of Ukraine because they speak Russian. They are Russian Orthodox, and they are Russians. So they don't need to do much. But Ukraine wants to Ukrainianize the entire country and be rid of the Russian influence. But if half the population speaks Russian, it's a much larger genocide to eliminate the Russian culture in Ukraine than the other way around.
Yeah, it's exactly the other way around. Just last question to you, Mikael.
Yes.
I'm very young, and you have the experience, and you have lived lots of events in the past, so you can base your opinion more on experience. But I'm just seeing that the future is very bleak now in Europe after all this escalation through the gate of Ukraine, and I don't see that the United States is going to back off from the Ukraine war unless something miraculous happens with the election of Trump, but then he will focus on other conflicts. But all in all, we can see that the world is being divided nowadays, and
yes.
the possibility or the potential for a big war, is really I don't want to say imminent, but I can see it in the foreseeable future, and I really don't want that to happen.
Yes, if we see it, it's not just a conflict between Russia and the West. We have the growing Cold War between the US and China, and there was a growing gap between the Western world and large parts of the global South. And it has been increased by the conflict in Gaza. If we just look on how South American politicians react towards the Israeli attacks against Gaza. So it might be, many in the West see the West as the world, and the rest is something that is not so important. But the rest is much larger than the West. And there's a big possibility that the West will become isolated. And if they become isolated, they will be dangerous and try to change regimes in many parts of the world. So I see it's a bleak future for peace and harmony in the world. The 90s was something like the 20s, 1920s, after the First World War. Oh, it's democracy. All the monarchies has been thrown over, and now we have a fantastic future. And very soon, things differed. And we are in a much more dangerous position now than during the Cold War, because then there were two parts, they respected each other. The West didn't do anything when Russian troops went into Hungary 56, Czechoslovakia in 68. It was their sphere of interest. But no, they don't respect each other at all. So it's very easy to get an escalation.
I really hope
and I don't. I neither hope it, but and I don't think it will be tomorrow. But things could happen. For example, if U.S. support an independence for Taiwan, and suddenly the regime in Taiwan declares independence, well, then we might have a Chinese invasion because they see it as a province within their own country. As if Hawaii declared independence, it wouldn't be accepted by Washington.
Yes, that's so true. Mikael Valtersson, I really appreciate you today. I really appreciate you today joining me and dedicating this time and your knowledge and experience with the audience of Syriana Analysis. Thank you so much for being with me. Really, I appreciate that. And guys, it goes without saying that the link of Mikael's X account, or Twitter, formerly known as Twitter, is in the description below. Hit him a follow and also read what he's writing about these cases. I think it's important to read all opinions to make up our minds. I just want to reply to one comment. One of our friends says, Kevork, why don't you engage in the chat, the live chat? The reason when I have an interview, guys, and I'm speaking to a guest, I want to focus what the guest says so that I can also ask follow-up questions. I cannot read all the comments, unfortunately, while you are writing hundreds of comments. That really like moves very fast into my eyes. I can't even focus, so I have to focus with the guest. But guys, I will come back to you on Monday, 5 p.m. Central European time, 11 a.m. Eastern American time, again in the new live stream. Saturday and Sunday there is no live stream. Mikael, thank you so much again for being with me.
Thank you for having me. It was very nice being with you.
It was really nice speaking to you.